My name is Catherine Douglas, and I will be presenting information on inclusive education. I'm going to begin by defining inclusive education, and then I'm going to discuss the history, the relevance, and how it can be applied to the classroom or the school environment. My presentation will end with a list of my references for the information found in the presentation. So I'll start off by defining inclusive education. In the text, Equity and Full Participation for Individuals with Severe Disabilities, TASH identifies inclusive education as having three main components. The first is an environment in which all competent students are a valued part of the community, which includes school activities and general education classes. Two is participation in classroom learning with same age and grade level peers who are without disabilities. And three is developing meaningful relationships with a variety of different students, both with and without disabilities. The main purpose of inclusive education is to provide all students with disabilities the same learning opportunities, both academic and social, as those without disabilities. So next, I'm going to talk about the history of inclusive education, and this is based on information from the Department of Education's IDEA website, published in February of 2024. So before the federal mandates were in place to protect the rights of people with disabilities, many children with disabilities were denied educational opportunities and an opportunity to be a part of the community. In fact, only 1 in 5 children with disabilities were even in school, and some states had laws which specifically excluded children who were blind, emotionally disturbed, or had intellectual disabilities. Many people with disabilities were placed in state institutions with restrictive environments and had little to no interactions with the outside community. They often had insufficient resources, such as little food, clothing, living space, or staff. People with disabilities also did not receive services to improve their overall quality of life, such as improving their academic skills, their social skills, independent living, self help skills. It was only through persistent advocating from families and other organizations that things did begin to change for the better. So, there was concern over the more than 1 million children with disabilities who were either denied an education altogether or who had limited and inappropriate opportunities for an education. So, as a result, the Education for All Handicapped Children Act, or EHA, was signed into law in 1975. This was a significant step towards the inclusive education of students with disabilities by guaranteeing them a free, appropriate public education, or FAPE. And this was guaranteed to every child with a disability in every state and locality in the United States. The four components of EHA were: one, that all children with disabilities were provided FAPE, which included special education and related services to meet the unique individual needs of every student with a disability. Two was to protect the rights of children with disabilities and their families. Three was to assist states and localities with providing FAPE through financial assistance and incentives. Four was to utilize assessments to ensure educational efforts were effective. And they made many revisions through the years with the the one that would be most relevant to inclusive education was made in the 90s, and it was a push towards students being placed in the least restrictive educational environment. So that means that students were to be placed and educated with their non-disabled peers to the highest extent possible, which is the central idea behind inclusive education. In 1990, Public Law 110-475 changed the name of EHA to the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA. There were many revisions to the law promoting inclusive education, including Public Law 105-17, which emphasized access to the general education curriculum for students with disabilities. And this allowed students with disabilities to be taught the same learning standards as their non-disabled peers. Another major revision was in 2004. It required three things. It required early intervention services for students who need extra supports, but may not have been identified as having a disability yet. It increased accountability for improved educational outcomes of students with disabilities, and it increased the standards for the special education instructors. And then again, in 2016, IDEA was revised, this time to promote equity and ensure that students with disabilities are properly identified and provided with services needed so that they can be placed in the least restrictive educational environment. And it prevented them from being removed from these environments for disciplinary reasons. And it also required educational agencies to identify and address disproportionate numbers of students being identified and placed in more restrictive settings. Inclusive education is a relevant subject because there are many benefits to individuals with disabilities and without disabilities. I read two different articles, one by the Australian Alliance for Inclusive Education and another by an organization called the Understood Team, which both outline the different benefits created by an inclusive education and an inclusive learning environment. So, studies have shown that students with disabilities who are placed in the general education classrooms usually outperformed their disabled peers who were placed in more restrictive, self-contained special education classrooms. They develop stronger reading and math skills. They have better attendance rates. They often have less behavior issues. And they're more likely to complete school. An inclusive education has a positive effect on the social and emotional well-being of students with disabilities. And this is partially because they're able to build and maintain a variety of meaningful relationships with different types of peers, both disabled and non-disabled. And also, there's been a positive correlation between inclusive education and improved post-high school outcomes. And this includes more people with disabilities pursuing a higher education after high school, and they often have increased employment opportunities and higher community involvement when they were given an inclusive learning environment. So there are at least four ways in which an inclusive education can benefit all students with and without disabilities. One thing is that the learning is tailored to fit the needs of all students through things like universal design and differentiated instruction. Another thing it does is it makes all students more accepting and comfortable to people's differences. More supports can be provided for all the students if things like speech therapy or special education instruction was brought into the general education classroom. And the last thing is that using strategies such as co-teaching or differentiated instruction, it makes mastering skills related to learning standards more attainable for everyone in the classroom. So this creates higher learning expectations for all students with and without disabilities. I'm going to discuss the applications of inclusive learning in the school and classroom environments, as well as best practices and strategies for implementing an inclusive learning environment, which can be found in the article of Benefits of Inclusive Education by the Princeton Review. So it's important to keep in mind the principles of inclusive education. These should be the driving force behind implementing inclusive practices in the classroom and at school. Um, Equality and diversity means that we should all be treated with dignity and respect and have equal access to meaningful education held at the same learning standards as peers without disabilities. Collaboration and partnership involves educators, parents, and students with and without disabilities all working together to meet the needs of everyone. Um, Students with disabilities should be given the same learning opportunities as peers without disabilities. They should be able to fully participate in school and classroom activities and should have access to the same educational materials. Um, Students should be empowered to take responsibility for and make decisions regarding their own education. So, ways to implement inclusive education practices include identifying and addressing barriers to inclusion, such as identifying the needs for supports and extra resources to students with disabilities, and modifying the curriculum to meet the needs of all learners. Create a supportive learning environment through developing a school or classroom culture that values diversity, collaboration, and teamwork. Provide resources and supports necessary for the success of students with disabilities. This can include support staff, tools, manipulatives, assistive technology, or other accommodations. And it's also important to use various strategies which promote active participation and engagement of students with disabilities in the classroom and in school-wide learning and social activities. So now I'm going to discuss some of the best practices identified by the Princeton Review for providing an inclusive education for students with disabilities. So, the best practices include utilizing a universal design for learning, which involves modifying the curriculum ahead of instruction to meet the various needs of all learners with or without disabilities. Differentiated instruction is a best practice which modifies the curriculum based on the specific needs of each student to be successful with or without a disability. Another best practice is peer support or mentoring, in which students can support each other and develop collaboration skills, social skills, and build meaningful, lasting relationships. And the use of IEPs or individual education plans, which is a personalized plan that's developed and implemented to address the specific learning needs of an individual student. With my presentation, here is a list of the references for the information that was provided in my presentation. Thank you.